Hi guys, it's Mark Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also it's Mark Zicree of Space Command. But in my youth, in my early 20s, I started writing for television, and I started in animation, and I ended up writing for some of the greatest animation shows ever done. And so what I'm going to do is I have a stack of stuff here from those days. We're talking late 1970s through the middle of 1980. This is the Ghostbusters Writer's Bible, written by Len Jensen and Chuck Menville, now for Deke Enterprises. Now, when the Ghostbusters movie came out, everyone loved it, of course, and especially us science fiction geeks. And so then, back then, they would tend to make animated shows based on successful movies. And so, Real Ghostbusters, of course, and the reason it was called Real Ghostbusters was because Filmation had previously done a live action show called Ghostbusters. It had nothing to do with the movie. It starred Larry Storch, and it had a gorilla in it. It was not not remotely connected to Ghostbusters, but it had the name, and so that's why this was called the Real Ghostbusters. And Len Jansen and Chuck Menville were a wonderful writing team. I first worked with them on Smurfs, and they were just goofy animation guys. They were really fun to work with and clever. And but then Joe Straczynski was brought aboard the story editor of the show with them, and he wanted to do our episodes like they were sequels to the movie. And the movie hadn't come out on home video yet. They sent us a VHS tape of the movie just to familiarize ourselves with it more. But that was quite, being on the inside track, because no one could get a copy of that movie. And so we just started, Michael Reeves and Joe Straczynski and I. This is way before Babylon 5. We just started cooking up storylines. It was great fun to write, and I'm very proud of the work I did on that show. Captain Eo, developed by Michael Reeves and Mark Scott Zicree. Now, Michael Jackson, this is dated 1986, 1/21/86. Michael Jackson had done a video for Disney that was a 3D attraction, sort of a music video where he's the captain of a spaceship and he's got all these strange creatures. So I think what we were doing was we were developing a Captain EO show, and it was going to be animated, I believe, and it never moved forward. But this was a gig. We were hired by Disney to write it. Now, also back then, we were just starting to get transition from typewriters to computers, and so back then it was fan fold paper. So basically, it would come out, and you'd have to remove the dot matrix holes that advance the text. So you'd strip that out, and then the paper would come out like this, and then you'd tear it to separate it. So this is a copy, I guess, that never got torn. And what this is a Ghostbuster outline. The way it worked usually is when we're writing animation, this is called No Fair for Ghosts. No Fair for the Ghosts. I think this is one that I ended up not going to script with, or maybe it went into changes, but I don't remember the title. But this is, often you come up with an idea and you type it up as a one-page premise, then you'd be greenlit to outline. This is an outline, and then you'd write the script. We have samurai spooks from the Japan Pavilion, so it's like clearly a World's Fair with stuff happening, and pretty cool, pretty rare. So now earlier, then here's another Ghostbusters piece. It's a 4-page outline / premise, and it's called The Ghost on the Beat. Now, often you'd generate a number of storylines and then only write, a handful of those, or a small percentage of those. And that might not be because there's anything wrong with the story, but it could be that someone else has come up with an idea that is similar or has a similar setting. That's why a story editor is working with a number of writers, so that they don't step on each other's toes in that way. So, but this is really, really fun. It has some of the dialogue. I don't like the look of this, says Pete. And but it was great fun writing on Ghostbusters. Now this is an outline for Bionic 6, and so I typed all of these things myself. There's no secretary working for me at this point. So this is dated in 1986. It's Bionic 6. That was a show that had sort of a family that had sort of like bionic powers. Again, the Bionic Man had already been on, and so this was sort of riffing on that, but with a family. And so this is an episode called The Hermit. And then there's another one. These are premises. There was one called, so I'd submit a number of storylines and then write scripts. So this is called Scarab for a Day, and then there's one called Take One, Rock One. And you basically, they would sometimes give you just a series Bible and some premises that they were developing, the horror from tomorrow. And you were always trying to be a last per JD. And often you'd be trying to kind of come up with lurid titles, or at least eye-catching titles. I remember when Michael Reeves and I wrote all the episodes of Pole Position, another animated show. It was sort of like Knight Rider, but again with like brother and sister, I think it was, or cousins. And so with that, every title I did was a riff on a Hitchcock title. So I had The Chicken Who Knew Too Much, things like that. More Bionic 6 outlines and premises. This is Centurions. Centurions was another show with guys who had sort of a G.I. Joe kind of thing. They had bionic fighting suits kind of stuff. And this is called Let the Games Begin. And this is the outline. It has whiteout because, again, we were, correcting stuff by hand often. And this is, again, dated... this one doesn't have a date on it, but it was around that same period. Ted Peterson story edited this show. He was a great guy, very quiet. He mumbled, and so you couldn't hear him unless you got really, 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 really close to him, and you'd have to like say, "Well, what'd you say, Ted? Say that again, please." And he was a cat lover, so he'd frequently have a cat on top of his computer, or maybe a cat on his shoulder, or a cat in his lap, or all three, and. But he was a very good story editor, and so it was always fine to work with him. This is and again this was limited animation, so it was animation every other frame, and it was called ink and paint. So it was actually done on celluloid, where they would draw the images on paper, then trace them in ink onto the front of the celluloid, then paint the back of the celluloid in color, and then they put that on what was called a pegboard, and then they would shoot it, and then they'd have the next motion, and then shoot that one, and so forth. Very laborious, and now of course it's all done by computer. So this is a vestige of a long gone day. Initially I would start from just handwritten notes, and so this is actually a handwritten storyline for Ghostbusters. And I haven't locked down all of the details yet. So it says, Egon invents a device for some purpose. And then by the time I got to the script, I would have figured out what the purpose is. It's like, ultimately, he asks something like, what is the purpose of life? Or what's the meaning of life? Or what's behind all this? And suddenly Mark Zicree appears. So this is a one where, I'm in the story as a character. That's very, very funny. And I ended up not writing this script, but it's a very funny idea. And at the same time, I came up with a storyline that I pitched to Amazing Stories, in which an animation writer slowly but surely starts to become an animated character. It's creeping up his arm. And I can't remember the details of that story, but they really liked it. It didn't end up getting made because they had this similar notion in one of their episodes where a World War II bomber gets cartoony tires, and that was a little too close to what I was coming up with. But here's another Centurions premise. It's called Siege of Skyvault, and it says alternate approach. So I might have gotten notes and come up with a variant on it. And then here's one called Like Father, Like Daughter. And again, what you're trying to do with these shows is, if there are multiple characters, you try and find a good use for each, and give them different business to do. Now, sometimes I would have less detailed ideas. So here's 2 on 1 page, and it's addressed to Ted Peterson, the story editor, and says, here are 2 additional Centurion ideas, less detailed than the others. And then I talk about that. You basically, it's beginning, middle, and end, or at least beginning and middle, and with the end suggested. And we were just writing at a crazy fast pace. You'd write a script. The longest you would have to write a script is a week. You might write it in a weekend. I once wrote a 53-page script in a day. That was for Black Star, and it got made. And we were often juggling between different shows because it was freelancers and story editors. And so while I was writing Centurions, I might be writing Puppy's Further Adventures, or Biscuits, or The Littles. There were only two kinds of cartoons back then. There was the superhero stuff, Super Friends, etc., and then there was the funny animal stuff. And the funny animal stuff might be Smurfs, or The Littles. But all of them had a similar amount of action, and also you had to have jokes in all of them. But there'd be fewer jokes in the superheroes ones, and more, of course, in the funny animal ones. And I remember there's one I did, I think it was for Bionic 6, and it was about a junk pile that comes to life. And my original working title on it was This Garbage is Revolting. And they changed the title, I think, to Junk Heap. Here's another Centurion's premise. survival course, and there's one called The Siege of Skyvault. Again, I grew up reading comic books and watching cartoons, and so it was very, very second nature, very natural to me to write in sort of this hyperbolic tone, Terror Town, Subway to Terror. Again, you'd be looking for variety of setting, of storyline, and you knew that there were certain things that were given, that you'd have action and all that, but you might set one story in a World's Fair, one story in a subway, one story on a desert island, etc. And but also utilizing your characters, utilizing their main settings, and if it was toy oriented, if it was something like He-Man, then they would say, okay, these are the toys and these are the things we want to feature and these are the characters, and it didn't stop you from coming up with creative storylines, because that was the main reason to do this. But you were cognizant of, okay, let's have Man of War, or Tila or whatever, and that sort of spoke to it. Tila was in Black Star, Man of War, of course, was in He-Man. Now here's another Ghostbusters one, the Ghost on the Beat, and that has, of course, the New York settings. And then we get to this one, Hug-a-Bunch. A hug for little sister. Now that's way over in the funny animal, little kid kind of realm. And those, and Fancy and Bubbles in Hug-a-Land. Fancy and Bubbles look through a mirror into the living room of two sisters. And so, so again, but you're trying. Someone asked me if I wrote for the children in the audience, and I always said that, no, I write for the children, for the child in myself. So I was always looking for what I would find funny, what I would find entertaining. And, but my long-term goal, was always to move into live action, to write for Star Trek and Babylon 5 and all those shows that I grew up loving, like Star Trek, the original Star Trek, and Twilight Zone and so forth. So, and they were very hermetically sealed at the time. Animation writers wrote animation, live action writers wrote live action. There was no crossover. And also TV writers wrote TV, features writers wrote features. Again, very little crossover. So I knew that, but Michael Reeves brought me into animation, and that was my way into television. So that was a step toward where I wanted to go. That said, I still brought my A game to everything I did, and whether it was Hug-a-Bunch or Smurfs or Ghostbusters, I was always trying to write at the highest level I could, and satisfy the requirements of the show, but also come up with things that I found interesting and I found fresh. And that could sometimes be a challenge, but that was always the intent. So over here is another. I turned out a ton of stuff for Ghostbusters. Here's the Junior Ghostbusters, another premise from '86. Now, by the time we got to 1989 or so, '88, that was when I was making the segue to live action. So, but animation was a lot of fun, and you'd watch it on TV. And here's the Ghost Zep, and that was about a Zeppelin. And we all loved Ghostbusters. Chuck and Len, who basically there were two camps doing the Ghostbusters show. There was Chuck and Len, who were much more cartoony. They were tending toward the Slimer kind of stuff, and Joe Straczynski, who was doing stuff where it was more adult and more satire oriented. And of course, Michael Reeves and I preferred writing that kind of stuff. Michael wrote the Collect Call of Cthulhu, which was his H.P. Lovecraft homage. So then this is in Elaine's hand, and I guess when we were writing something relating to swamps and plants and animals, she I guess did some research for me, and it's included in here, and that's pretty interesting. And then now also sometimes when you're coming up with ideas, you make a list of possible themes or possible settings, and so this is possible family themes. And so and again, this stuff was all, I typed all of this stuff. So like, here's some of them. I wrote down 47 of them. One is feeling your best friend likes someone better than you. Just say no, peer pressure, name calling, respect for property, strangers, respecting the elderly, think before you speak. A friend is injured, how to handle an emergency. We all don't get punished in the same way. Being part of a group, needing more information, becoming successful at something you hate, running away from home, etc., losing a loved one. So any of these could be springboards for storylines, either in the superhero realm or in the funny animal realm. Now also, some shows wanted you to have a very clear moral lesson, other shows less so. And so again, knowing what you were writing for, now here's one called Master of the Bow. And that's interesting. That's Dungeons and Dragons. Now, the interesting thing about Dungeons and Dragons was I didn't end up writing for that show, but Michael Reeves wrote a ton of them, and he was supposed to write the end of the of the show. And one of the ideas I came up with for Dungeons and Dragons, Michael called me and he said, "Do you mind if I use that idea of yours?" So here's two outlines I did for Dungeons and Dragons, and he utilized these in the show, even though I wasn't credited, because at that point we were writing so many shows and we were very good friends, and so I didn't need him to say, "Oh, I didn't need to say to him, okay, pay me, blah blah blah, credit me." It was irrelevant at that point. So. But yes, there's these two storylines, which is pretty cool. This is real rarity. Then this is a Super Friends premise. Very, very fun. In the American Southwest, Apache chief is visiting some young Indian archaeology students, blah, 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 blah. And Superman's in this one too. Now, originally when I wrote for Super Friends, it was the superheroes I'd grown up with: Superman, Green Lantern, Batman, Wonder Woman. And then later in the show, they developed sort of the more socially relevant ones, like Apache Chief, who was Native American. And this also has dinosaurs in it, because I always love dinosaurs. And but this one has Superman, Hawkman, and Flash as well. And again, it was really fun to be writing for these characters that I loved as a kid and that were so central to my life. And so this is The Lost Temple, and that's, I guess one of the ones I wrote. And then here's a He-Man premise. Now you can see that the whole notion of premises, outlines, scripts, from company to company, to show, it was basically the same way of working. And so, but this is a He-Man premise, the fortress in the swamp. Now that was for Filmation, and we did, initially Michael and I wrote, I think, all or almost all of the episodes of Black Star, which was sort of an astronaut gets lost through a black hole and finds himself sort of on a barbarian planet where he becomes a barbarian hero. And that led directly to He-Man being created, and they're very similar in tone. And so this is when He-Man started up. When He-Man started up, they hadn't animated any of it, so they brought us in and they talked about it, and the prospective writers. And we were given the Bible for the show, which was this big, thick thing. And we just started coming up with ideas. And so so sometimes you would be brought onto a show that already had shot something, or as in Ghostbusters, it had been, a movie previously. And so you had something to hang your hat on. With some other of these, it was just like, okay, do the best you can, given that you don't know what it's going to look like, what it's going to sound like. But this has He-Man, Teela, Gorpo, Lizardman, Spyman, Skeletor. Yeah, it's a Sorceress, Black Legion. Wow. Oro, and, all these different characters. Now, this is interesting, because one of the things Michael Reeves used to do, and I did it for a short time, was he would reuse paper. And so there's a totally different thing on the back of these pages. Major Ned Talbot. Yeah, so there's, for the Hulk, I wrote for the animated Hulk, so there's information about the Hulk in here, and, and like Lois Lane, he might even sometimes suspect that there's a connection between the Hulk and Banner, only to be cleverly convinced otherwise by Rick or Banner himself. So when I did the Hulk outline, you reused the paper on the other side for Super Friends, or for He-Man in this case, and pretty crazy. But again, we were juggling multiple projects, and also at that time, the reason I stopped doing that Michael Reeves trick was because you'd get confused if there was some different thing on the other side of the page. So, that's why that was a very short-lived. This is Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. So this is a Spider-Man outline, and I don't even remember writing for the Spider-Man cartoon, but apparently I did. The Ice Brute. Bobby, Peter, and Angelica are out for a pleasant stroll in Shady Glen when suddenly they happen on a bank robbery in progress. They immediately transform into the Spider Friends and take on the criminals. Well, there you go. And Dr. Mutant is in this. So, it was just kind of fun. And the fact that I was writing DC Comics and Marvel Comics, these animated characters, the animation was limited. It wasn't later. In later decades, the animation in television would get much better. But this still has its own iconic look, and if you grew up during this period, you loved that look, because it was what you were familiar with, and what I often say kids have no taste, and the reason I say that is because they're not saying, well, this looks like crap. They're not. If they're entertained, if they're amused, if they are engaged, they don't care about the quality, quote unquote. And so the fact that they have no taste is a good thing, not a bad thing. There are movies that I love that, watching them as an adult, I can see their flaws, but I forgive them that because I loved them as a child and still love them. So here's Kingdom of the Mirage, another He-Man premise, and again with the Hulk on the back. And then here's Quest for the Old Hermit, which is Johan and Pee-wee. Here's another Spider-Man trapped in the realm of Ride-a-Lock. That's another Spider-Man premise. Gosh, some of these shows I don't even remember working on. You know, it's so funny. And here's He-Man, Masters of the Universe, the Evil Wraiths of Eternia. You know, and again, you know, this stuff is, you know, just, it's wonderful to see the progression of these stories, because in many cases you'll see that there'd be changes along from premise to outline to script to finished episode. And, you know, but pretty much everything I wrote was for, it was for an assignment, it was for money. I was never coming up with animated ideas just for the hell of it. That was never, whereas you might write a spec feature or come up with a show of your own on spec, you would never do that other than there's a show that's up, they're buying, you know, come up with some ideas. And sometimes, by the way, they run an idea by you. So they might say, well, we need to do an Orko story, and he needs to be, you know, he needs to be on a, you know, stuck in a you know, lagoon or whatever was they needed for production. So, you know, what kind of king will I be if I can't even protect myself from a giant plant? I think this is a very important question even today. So now here's another one I have almost no memory of, the Care Bears movie. At one point I outlined a Care Bears movie, and it ends one makes friends by being a friend. Timmy, the bears, and the cousins begin their journey by entering a major city's vast sewer system. Well, that would have been entertaining. So, in a tiny part of a big city lives Timmy, a lonely little boy being raised by his widowed mother. Well, there you go. So again, Care Bears, you know, and so, now again, as I say, sometimes I would start by just handwriting a thing, then I'd type it up before I would send it in. This is pole position premise. It's an outline, as I mentioned. I mean, it's a pole position premise, one-page premise. And as I mentioned, I was doing riffs on all the Hitchcock movie titles. So this is called The Wrong Meringue, after the wrong man. And it says, the truck is driving through an industrial section of New Jersey, Dan having gotten them hopelessly lost with everybody starving and not a fast food joint in sight. Tess convinces Dan to pull over. They'll ask a factory foreman for directions. Meanwhile, Kuma and Daisy, and Kuma was named after Michael Reeves' dog. Michael developed this show for TV. And Daisy spot a huge confectionery company with a tray of tarts sitting at the loading dock. And it goes on and on and on. But, you know, big finale in a candy factory, pie fight, Dan bursting out of cake, so forth. So again, you know, it's kind of rough in premise, but if they approved it, then it would get much more detailed. And here's Smurfs. Here's a Smurfs premise. This is one that Michael Reeves. Here's Smurfs in Slumberland. Now, this is a number of different premises that Michael Reeves and I came up with. And so there's Smurfs in Slumberland, Spooked Smurfs, the Seashells, S-E-E, Brainy, Smurfette, Clumsy, Vanity, Hefty, and Lazy are out in the woods playing a rousing game of Smurf ball. Suddenly, the ball bounces off an odd object sticking up out of the ground. Investigating, the Smurfs discover that it is the edge of a buried trunk. Digging it up and opening it, they find that it is filled with beautiful shells and a warning. Anyway, so, et cetera, et cetera. So these are actually look like outlines rather than premises. They're a little long. Here's one called Good Neighbor Smurf. Michael and I wrote, I think, one or two together, then we wrote a bunch of them, you know, separately, because by that point it was very obvious that I could write them on my own. But Michael and I have stayed friends all these years, and in fact, he and I wrote the George Takei Star Trek episode together, and which you can watch on Mr. Sci-Fi, and Michael won an Emmy for the animated Batman, so Batman the Animated Series. Here's another He-Man premise, Ordeal in the Darklands. Kurtalak, once a good sorcerer, has been convinced by Skeletor that He-Man is responsible for the disappearance of his daughter. And then he swears revenge, of course he does. And coming up with the names is often a challenge. And I remember one time on Black Star, I named the Lord of Time Cadre after my friend Richard Cadre. And they made a toy of that character, and Richard's mother went to Toys R Us and bought a bunch of them, and she was holding one of them up in the line waiting for the cash register, and she was saying, "This is my son!" And Richard Cadre is now a very well-known science fiction writer, and with the Sandman Slim series of books. And but these were the people I was hanging out with at that time, and being friends with, and so forth. So that's how it works. This is another He-Man one called Reign of the Demon God, which then became Reign of the Monster God. And then they didn't want me to use the word God in the title, so it just became Reign of the Monster. He-Man, Teela, Man-at-Arms, Gorpo, I think that's Orko, became Orko. Sometimes, prior to getting shot, these characters would undergo name changes and even design changes. And, but, so this is a full, you know, little outline / premise. And again, I use the Hulk material for the back of the pages. And, yeah, Mulcrum. Yeah, this one had Mulcrum, and someone once asked me. I think it was when I did the audio commentary of this episode for the He-Man Blu-ray, and they asked me where I came up with the name Mulcrum for the villain, for the monster, and I said, well, you know, there's a great sequence in Metropolis by Fritz Lang where this monster appears, Moloch, and all these workers are being swallowed into his gaping mouth, and that was the inspiration. I totally made that up on the moment. It had nothing to do with Mulcrum. I just thought I would sound erudite and interesting. Here's another Masters of the Universe premise, Gorpo the Gargantua. So that this is Orko. He was originally called Gorpo, I guess. That makes him huge, powerful, and evil. Okay, yeah. How can he stop Gorpo from destroying all Eternia without harming him? That's okay, good. Now here's another one, another Smurfs premise, Prince Gargamel. Gargamel was voiced by Paul Winchell, and when I was a kid, Paul Winchell had a show on TV where he was a ventriloquist with Jerry Mahoney and Knucklehead Smith. Those were his two dummies, which was kind of a riff on Charlie McCarthy and, you know, Edgar Bergen and all that stuff. And but it was great fun to be writing for someone who was one of my heroes when I was a kid. And we once asked, but when Smurfs was just starting up, before they'd animated anything, they flew out the two creators of Smurfs to Hanna-Barbera for us all to meet, all the writers to meet with them, and it was Peo and Delaporte. And we asked them, Patsy Cameron, who was one of our writers, she said, why is there only one female Smurf? And Peo said, Smurfette is all women. Think of her as your daughter, your mother, your sister. And Patsy said, oh, so it's just like Papa has one job, he's the papa, and another Smurf is the strong one, and another Smurf is the brainy one, and this Smurf is the girl one. And we used to joke that she was very busy on a Saturday night in the Smurf village. Here's one called Hail to the Smurf, which I probably spilled Coca-Cola or something on. Yeah, and here's Smurf ideas, and this is just where I just start banging out a bunch of ideas to then refine them into you know, more finished ideas. And my 13th idea here is Brainy casts a spell that makes two Brainies, one orange, one green, both of which are grown Smurfs of a different color. So there you go. They're not all winners. And here's another Smurf one called Hefty and the Smurfonauts. So that's fun, which is Jason and the Argonauts, because I grew up with Ray Harryhausen, of course. Now, this is a very interesting thing. This is the outline for the magnifying mixture, which is one of the episodes that got shot. And this has notes by the story editors. So this would be notes by Chuck Menville and Len Jansen. So Len's notes are in red, and Chuck's are in pencil. And so it's just they went through making copious notes on this, and then I would revise it according to their notes, and then before going to script. You know, and so that was, but you can see they really marked it up, and you know, but they were very, very scrupulous, and they were great guys. And Chuck sadly died young of cancer, which was really a shame, because he was a vegetarian. He exercised, he played tennis. He was the last guy you'd think would get cancer. It was cancer of the spine, oddly enough, and he left you know, young children and a wife, and it was really, 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 really sad. And he was a terrific guy, very funny and very smart, and. Okay. And at one point he writes, one of the things I have in here, not believable for one moment. And then, keep in mind, this is the Smurfs. So, wouldn't happen in a Smurfy world. Okay, there's a Smurf Odyssey, which is another one that Michael and I wrote. And again, you know, all of the writers were extremely well read. Most of us were big science fiction fans. Most of us knew horror fiction. Many of us knew classical fiction. So a Smurf Odyssey is, again, a commentary on, you know, Homer's Odyssey. And you know, and we have a character in here named Hieronymus, which I'm sure did not last till the final draft of the script. Here's Renaissance Smurf. I was a big fan of Renaissance artwork and so forth, knew a lot about it because my degree was in art. And so, you know, we were just pouring out material. And this is also, by the way, all, you know, until 1982, everything that's dated earlier than 1982 in this, or up to 1982 in this collection, I was writing The Twilight Zone Companion during that same 5-year period, from 77 to 82. And so, you know, we were all of us multitasking big time. And so, you know, and we were all very, very ambitious. All of the writers were in their 20s and early 30s. And so, again, we were all ambitious, all intending to take the world by storm, which some of us did and some of us less so. But certainly Paul Dini did very well. Michael Reeves did very well. Just a ton of us. There was Marv Wolfman, Len Jansen. Many of them were also working in comic books. And some would go on to features and TV shows. Of course, you know, Joe Straczynski would go on to create Babylon 5. So here's one called Pixelated Smurfs, and another premise. And the last line is, the Smurfs must set things right or find themselves part of a 2-course meal composed of pixies and Smurfs. Here's one. Here's a Smurfs premise called Even Jokey Gets the Blues. Now, you know, it might be like 1 in 10 of these I remember. Okay, because it's just, again, it was all being done so fast. And, you know, and this, again, was the 1970s, 1980s. This was, animation was very, very different then. These were mainly Saturday morning shows. I mean, you know, something like He-Man was syndicated, but most of these aired on ABC, CBS, NBC. So when I first met Joe Straczynski, he was a journalist and not making much of a living. And so Michael Reeves and I both were the gods of animation at that time. And so we recommended to Filmation that they hire him, or Hanna-Barbera and so forth. And so he did get hired. And then when I developed Captain Power for television as a live action kids show, but actually intended as an adult science fiction show, they wanted me to story edit, and I was writing features at the time and really wasn't available. But I guaranteed Joe Straczynski, even though he had never story edited a live action show, and they hired him. I said, if he's not able to do it, I'll do it. I'll step in, backstop him. And Joe ended up doing very well on Captain Power. And the producers were Doug Netter and John Copeland, and the 3 of them together made Babylon 5. And I also wrote for that show. So this is really charting the history of science fiction television, because so many of us who wrote for these shows went on to write for Star Trek: The Next Generation, Babylon 5, Sliders, of course, you know, many of the shows, and are continuing to do so. So, and also, you know, many of us were writing novels at the time. Michael Reeves was writing things like Dragon World, and now he writes Interworld with Neil Gaiman. And the illustrious J. Michael Straczynski. Here's a Hulk outline. It's the Hunter and the Hulk. In the Caribbean, Bruce Banner, Betty Ross, and Major Ned Talbot are aboard a helicopter bound for an aircraft carrier on which General Thunderbolt Ross is preparing to test the experimental proton obliterator. Here's a Super Friends premise, Island of the Dinosaurs. And then this has, who's in it? Wonder Woman, Batman, Apache Chief. Here's one Spider-Man one called Pawns of the Metal Master. Now, sometimes, you know, if you were just adding certain bits and pieces, you would actually cut up the pages and tape the certain sections on the new stuff, and then run it through a typewriter and type the new stuff. And so that's, you know, again, because you didn't want to have to retype a whole thing. And back at this point, you didn't have, I mean, if you wanted to make a Xerox copy of something, you'd have to go to where there was a Xerox machine. You didn't have printers that could also copy at that point. And and this actually, feeling this with my fingers, this is actually, this was written on a typewriter. This one, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Here's more Spider-Man premises. This is the animated Spider-Man, of course. Battle of the Star Warriors. Okay, wow, great. And it's also the Ice Brute. Well, this is notes on the Ice Brute. After Firestar superheats the Ice Brute, exhausting his freezing power and turning him back to Bobby, Spidey races over to him. How do you feel, he asks. Bobby answers, like I've been at a barbecue with me as the hamburger. Well, that incredible wit of mine was in full flower back then, certainly. Now, the first cartoon I wrote with Michael Reeves was Space Stars, which was Space Ghost. And Michael wrote basically all of them, brought me in to write with him, and then I started writing on my own. So it says Space Stars finale, because that was the last section of that show. This is Hanna-Barbera Productions. So Hanna-Barbera no longer exists, but they did Quick Draw McGraw and Yogi Bear and Huckleberry Hound and Tom and Jerry. They were one of the top animation studios. And also at that time, with Filmation and with Hanna-Barbera, you had companies where all of the animation was done here in America. Over the next few years after that, it would start being farmed out to Asia and Japan and so forth. And then you would have sort of a lot of the writers here, the storyboard guys here, the designers here, and then the animation being done overseas. And sometimes they wouldn't quite get what you were intending, and you'd get stuff back that was very odd. The Time Gun. This is Space Stars finale. Uglor's scientists developed the Time Gun, an awesome weapon which can accelerate or reverse the flow of time. So again, this is really strongly based on all the science fiction stuff we were reading and watching. And funny thing about Uglor, he was the villain. And again, we were writing incredibly fast. And sometimes in animation scripts back then, you had to call every single shot. So it might be 2 shots, Space Ghost and Uglor or whatever. And Michael Reeves was one who was writing so quickly that he meant to type long shot Uglor, and instead he typed dong shot Uglor and sent it into the network. And the network censors had a very specific note on that one. And so now this is a Hulk premise, Return of the Ancient One. And this is Xolotl. This is the one dealing with Aztecs. And Quetzalcoatl is in this, the giant winged serpent god of the Aztecs. And so again, we would also, by the way, do research. So we wouldn't just throw something together that wasn't accurate. Some shows needed to be very accurate, some less so. When Elaine and I wrote for Liberty's Kids, every single line had to have a footnote proving that it was really said, or written by one of those Revolutionary War characters. But like in this episode of The Hulk, clearly I've done my homework. And Kidnapped to the Stars, another Hulk premise that has robots and so forth. And here's the Green Menace. Determined to capture the Hulk, General Thunderbolt Ross enlists the aid of Marius Gordon, a brilliant scientist and military tactician. While Gordon is on the base, Bruce Banner is intent on remaining calm and not turning into the Hulk. But when Betty Ross is menaced by an avalanche set in motion by one of Gordon's thunderous inventions, Banner is forced to become the Hulk in order to save her. But with the Hulk finally arrived, Gordon is ready for him, and it goes on from there. And there can only be, and it ends, there can only be one Hulk, and which one emerges will determine the fate of mankind. There's a Smurfs idea or Smurfs premise written by me and Michael Reeves, and it's called Turncoat Smurfs. And I think Chuck Menville marked this up, and it says, explain the title, what turncoat means. They would make sure that we were all on the right beam. And and again, you would be writing these for the story editors, and then once it was in shape, they would ship it to the network for approval, and the network would give you notes. And BS&P, which was the censors, Broadcast Standards and Practices. So here's more. I did a ton of these. Michael Reeves and Mark Zickery, Smurfs premise, such Smurf as dreams are made of. And so again, that's Shakespeare. And but we all had grown up watching the same shows. We had the same references. So at one point I talked about magicians, and I mentioned a magician in this episode of Smurfs called Hesperia, who was like the absent-minded Aunt Esmeralda of Bewitched, because we'd all grown up watching Bewitched. Here's Sloppy's Spring Cleaning. So yeah, okay. Here's Superstars premise, The Lava Men. Now that got made. I remember it. I've seen that one. Superman, Green Lantern, and Black Vulcan are astounded when Niagara Falls suddenly turns into a series of fire falls. So pretty fun. Wanted, the Hulk. This is another Hulk springboard, and here's my resume from this time, which is pretty cool to have this. This is hand typed. You can feel the letters, and there's whiteout on it. And this is my literary agent at the time was Richard Curtis in New York. My books were The Twilight Zone Companion, my short stories and articles were Leader of the Club, A Subjective Tour of the Twilight Zone, Rod Serling, Twilight Zone Magazine, America Enters the Twilight Zone, blah, blah, blah. This is before the Twilight Zone Companion came out. The Twilight Zone Companion is listed here in 1982. So this is written around 1982. And then it lists the teleplays, these different cartoons I've written for, and the ones I wrote with Michael Reeves, and in progress, Getting By screenplay, and something called Will You Look at That? Science Fiction and Fantasy on Radio, which was an article. Cool. Here's Hannah Banana, which Chuck and Len story edited. Here's a premise called The Banana Boat. I don't remember much about this except it had orangutans in it. And I think that was kind of inspired by Any Which Way But Loose, which was a Clint Eastwood movie that had orangutans. Here's Johann and Pee-wee premise, The Smurf Siren. So Johann and Pee-wee was a Smurf offshoot because it has Smurfs in it. So there you go. Handy's Dilemma, another Smurfs premise. And again, you see that some of them are about Brainy, some are about Handy, some are about Smurfette, some are about Papa. You know, you just kind of try and mix it up as much as you can. There's another Smurf premise, Papa's Aplenty. Here's one called Squinting Smurf, when Brainy accidentally breaks his glasses. Here's something called a Smurf premise called The Blue Team. And this is, I think, is it an outline? It looks a little long to be a premise. I think it's an outline, I think. So, and then here's one called The Great Smurfaroo, which is another storyline. And, you know, it's just fun because some of these stories would get developed and maybe not made. By the time it got to outline, you were being paid. With the premises, often you were pitching those, so you might not have been paid for those, but you had the opportunity. And every show I pitched to, I ended up writing for. So it wasn't like, you know, I was trying to break in. I was in at that point. You could earn $100,000 a year writing animation, which was very good money then. You could earn that in 3 or 4 months, and that's why that 1 year I did that, and then spent the rest of the year writing a spec screenplay. That screenplay sold, got me a pilot deal with NBC, and that was how I was off and running in live action. So, you know, so pretty interesting. Spook Smurfs is another premise. So, you know, and again, it's like, you know, we would have, you know, robots, inventions, ghosts, you know, whatever, you know, but different shows would have different things that you could do in them. So obviously the Smurfs was much more fantasy than science fiction, whereas other shows might be a lot more science fiction oriented. So whereas Ghostbusters, of course, was both. Here's a Super Friends premise called The Super Brute, and Brainiac's Arcade, Super Friends. And again, one question you would often have if you're writing for superheroes you'd grown up with were how many of the characters you read in the comics were going to appear in the show. So for instance, you might have Brainiac, but you might not have Crypto, the super dog, or Supergirl. You know, you need to find that out and to know who are the characters that you could utilize. Additionally, and the shows changed year to year, and also if they had changed story editors, that would change the kinds of stories they'd want to do. And often you put in references to your own life. So for instance, here's a premise for Super Friends, The Dinosaur Invasion, where I refer to Professor Elliot Chang. Well, Elliot Chang was a friend of mine that I went to high school with, and we did a radio play together called Lobotomy that I wrote and directed, and Elliot was in it, and he produced it. But this is another one about dinosaurs. So that's the lot. That's the batch. So that's a little tour of my work in animation. I've done this for perks of those materials that are going to be sent to people who've pledged in one of our campaigns, and they'll be getting copies of all that material. But I think I'll probably put this also on Mr. Sci-Fi so that everyone can get a sense of what it was like to work back then. It was very different from now. There was freelance assignments. There was a tremendous energy and a very great good-heartedness. We were supportive of each other. So if we knew of a show that was open, we would tell our friends. Candace Montero represented all of us as an agent. She was the first agent to rep animation writers, and Michael Reeves was her first client, and I was her second. And we'd all hang out together. We all knew each other. It was very convivial, very collegial, and many of these people I still am friends with. Michael Reeves and Buzz Dixon and Mel Gilden, and some of them have gone on to greener pastures, such as Ted Peterson, and we miss him very much. So that's about it for now. We'll talk again real soon. Thanks, guys. Take care. Bye.